Welcome to another episode of the Ordinary Idiots podcast, where my goal is to dive deep into the extraordinary lives of ordinary people whose stories are rooted in faith, resilience, and purpose. I'm your host, David Morillo, and today we're exploring the journey of a leader who has dedicated his life to building relationships and fostering creativity and serving his community with unwavering faith. And the reality is that I'm underselling him. He is my friend. He is a pastor to me. He is a mentor to me. He is an example of what it means to live out a life of a long walk of obedience in the same direction. Our guest today is, again, one of my friends named Pastor Vernon Rainwater. He is a man whose life has been a remarkable tapestry of service and music and leadership. And I would just say that one of the things I've admired the most about him and his accomplishments is that he is a dedicated husband. His wife, Connie, is amazing, and he has two incredible daughters, Claire and Mandy. And he's also a great grandfather, not a great grandfather, but he is a great adjective grandfather. Um, and so I've seen him steward his family really well. And on top of those accomplishments, which on their own are legacy plays in terms of how he loves his wife and how he loves his children and how he loves his grandchildren and his extended family. For over 3 decades, Vernon served as pastor at Northland Church, based here out of Orlando, Florida, and he played an instrumental role in shaping the church distributed philosophy that they had and touching lives through his leadership and worship. His journey has been one that has been incredible. However, it hasn't stopped. There was this inspiring transition a few years ago in where Vernon stepped away into a new chapter as chief of staff at Full Sail University, a hub of innovation and creativity based here in Winter Park, Florida. And in his role, he's bringing a unique blend of pastoral care, leadership, and love for the arts to a completely new audience and proving once again that faith and creativity can thrive hand in hand. I know because I've seen this firsthand. I had the privilege of being able to work for him, probably very accurate, but work with him to some capacity. And today we'll talk to Vernon about his journey from leading hymns at 6 years old to pastoring a global congregation and now shaping the future of creative leaders at Full Sail. And then we'll land the plane with Vernon sharing some of his insights on Advent. Truth be told, is that's the reason why I invited him here is to speak about Advent, but I did not want to waste the opportunity and not only hear about Advent because it's important that he would communicate about Advent to me, because of what he represents in my life as it relates to my spiritual formation, but it's also important that I think you get to hear about the man you're learning from. And so, that I get to call friend, I get to call pastor, I get to call mentor. I just get to call Vernon and just see him living out his faith authentically. And so, with that being said, he didn't know that he was going to get invited for all of this. But get ready for an inspiring conversation with Pastor Vernon Rainwater. And so, let's just jump in. And I just want to start off by saying, welcome, Vernon. It is just again a gift to have you on here that you would say yes out of your busy schedule, come on here and your generosity in doing so. So I wanted to really set the stage for everyone that doesn't know you. I've had the privilege and the honor of getting to know you over the last several years. And what's been beautiful about my experience of you is that I didn't get to meet the persona of uh, Pastor Vernon Rainwater when he was leading a congregation at Northland. I got to meet the man, Vernon Rainwater, who was in deep is in deep pursuit of an authentic, meaningful relationship with our Father. And so when I think about your journey from soldier to a touring musician to pastor and now chief of staff at Full Sail University, which is quite remarkable. You're kind of like the faith-based Dos Equis guy, minus the Mexican beer.
Just
Can
water, just water.
just water
Yeah.
imported from the Fiji Mountains.
I didn't buy
Uh,
it. Drinking
uh,
water I didn't buy.
yeah, well, praise the Lord, you got it. Can
Mhm.
you start by sharing a little bit about your early experiences that set you on this unique path that you have found yourself on?
Well, thanks, David. Well, I'm truly the one who is honored to be sitting with you, my brother. Um, I have learned a lot about who Jesus is and who you referred to as our dad, through you and through your life and example. So thankful to be in your presence, even virtually like this. But my journey to David was early. I grew up in a Christian home. Meaning my parents were Christians, have three brothers. So I grew up in this setting where there were all young men, except for my mom, and that's another story we don't have time for. But they set such a great example for me. I went into the army where it was all men at that time. So I was just so thrilled to get married and get away from men. And uh, so after the military, and I came back to this country and pursued a degree in social work, and thought that I would spend much of my life working with families that, and particularly young people that had come through troubled situations. There were a lot of things related to that call, but um, yeah, so I got a master's in social work at the University of Kentucky, and I didn't play basketball there, but I just
Or any.
any other university. Yeah,
Right.
that's the only one we have in the state of Kentucky. So just kidding. I don't want to make people mad that went to others. Anyway,
What I can tell you is that probably most of my audience is not. And
gotcha. Good to know. Good to know. So some really amazing things happened to me on that journey, David. I had a profound encounter with Jesus through an artist, a musical artist named Keith Green. Really challenged me, changed me, called me. I ended up going to seminary, interned in a church while I was in seminary. Decided I'll never work in a church after that internship, and they probably would have agreed with that assessment. And then I I got this opportunity to come to Orlando, Florida, and work in a faith-based adolescent treatment facility, uh, which I which I did. Moved my family here in 1985, and I still had some obligations to the military, and so I left Connie and my daughters here for 6 weeks and went back to Europe to finish out that obligation. Came back, and Connie said, "Well, I've done 2 things while you were gone. I bought a car." I was like, "Awesome." And I found our church, and I was like, I might wanna weigh in on that one. Don't really care about the car." So, she chose Northland Church, and we were a part of Northland Church for 5 or 6 years before I came on staff there, and at the time, Joel Hunter and I were the only staff people when I came on there, and um, God, in spite of us, God just chose to really bless and grow that church. And over about 32 years, I
mm,
was able to serve God and serve that congregation. It was a joy of my life to do so. But as stories go, as times go, we Joel and I both exited about the same time, and uh, through a little bit of a circuitous journey, I ended up uh, being very blessed to come and serve here at Full Sail University. I feel much like a pastor here. And you know this place, David, and I'm just thrilled with all the things I get to do here.
well, man, thank you so much for that super concise, abridged version of the story. I do want to go back just for 1 second. We clearly don't have the bandwidth, the time constraints won't allow us to. Um, but just for the audience, you have a background that took you into the military. There are some law enforcement aspects of your life that went there, which at times I would imagine can make someone hard, regardless of your background. Because one of the things I oftentimes will quote is this thought: "Don't ask fish what's water." Right? It doesn't know. And so growing up in a household where like the worldview of your home and the worldview within the context of your community is the same. However,
Mm,
sometimes it's been my experience, and I'm sure you can attest to this, that it doesn't become our faith. It is just what we
mm,
do. It is what we're known for. It is just kind of uh, what the culture does. When you mentioned Keith Green, which I also am a big fan of Keith Green, not to the same level as you, but also a big
mhm,
fan of Keith Green. He definitely knew how to write these songs that would just create a sense of conviction and longing for more of God. If you haven't had an opportunity to hear him, I would just YouTube that. Um, Lord, you're beautiful specifically. Let that hit you
mm,
between the eyes, and, and that'll get you good. But with that being
mm.
said, what was it about that time in your life and the songs that caused you to pivot into this deeper commitment to your relationship with Christ?
You know, David, it was a time in my life where our life was not easy. At the time, I was trying to do a whole lot of things at once, which was not smart. I wasn't doing any of them very well, including being a husband, being a father, um, being in law enforcement, and I was a musician thinking I was a superstar, and just waiting for people to figure that out. And Keith Green, I heard this song of Keith Green's that has these lines, "Jesus rose from the dead, and you can't even get out of bed." And, I say those lines now and I think, "Well, yeah, how in the world?" But man, at the time, it just hit me like a 2 before in the between the eyes or in the forehead or something, and it got my attention, and I just began to, um, talk to God about that and say, "I wanna get out of bed." I wanna get into it. I wanna get busy. Um, and and it was that song, that did that for me. God could have used anything, he could have used anything. He chose to use that.
But I think that there's something to be said about how he pursues us and captures our heart. I oftentimes use the illustration that I have two girls. I have a 12 and 11-year-old. I'm an Esther, and I love them deeply the same way that you have Mandy and Claire, right? Like you and your
Mhm,
grandchildren now, you have an additional extension of that. But you love them deeply to the point where you can't even articulate why you love them because there's just
mm,
no language for it. However, how you express that to each person is different, right? Because
mm,
if you
mhm,
try to express it the same way across the board, it's not gonna work because for some odd reason, I don't understand the science, I don't know the math, but you put them in the same house, same food, same everything, and they come out as
mm,
totally different people. And what I
mm,
love about your story is this idea, because you didn't kind of touch on this. I led with this a little bit, and in your introduction, I talked about this. Based on the research I did, you were kind of leading hymns at the age of 6, is that right? Like, you were
Yeah, you did some deep research because I didn't,
yeah, I had to look for some deep cuts. So
yeah, in our church that I grew up in, I was really captivated by music from the time I could talk. I mean, everybody in my family kind of played musical instruments and sang, and yeah, I was trying to do all that early on, and it was a thing all through adolescence and high school. I played in all kinds of bands and whatnot. Yeah.
yeah, so that's kind of what I'm saying. It would make sense that our dad would reach you through music. This
mm,
medium that from the earliest age, he had embedded inside of you this gift.
mm,
And oftentimes we don't know what it's for. We don't have language for it. We just feel compelled or drawn to something. And long and behold, it's like my conversion experience happened in the back of a car outside of the context of a church. It wasn't a pastor. It wasn't a worship
mm,
song. It was literally reading the book of Revelation,
mm,
and where I had an encounter with him. And it's
mm,
really marked my life, because it's, in a lot of ways have felt outside of the frame of, organized religion, and that's where
mm,
how I came to experience him, and, he tells Peter, "I'm gonna make you a fisher of men." He just recontextualizes the thing that he was already doing, and he says, "Let me show you what this means to me," and so for you, music has been such a special part of your narrative, at least as far as I've known you, and, based on your history. I do wanna go back to something really quick. Your journey from soldier to touring musician to pastor has been super remarkable. But you joined Northland in 1990 and you witnessed incredible growth and change. What are some of the most memorable moments from your time there?
Mm. You know, the thing that comes to mind very first, I mean, again, Northland, lots of people say, well, it's because of God did this and God did that. And that's true. I don't mean that in any casual way. But God really did do it there. I mean, we didn't really we weren't strategic at first. We sure didn't understand what God was doing. But one of the highlights, many highlights actually, and memories, but a couple would be one where Northland really took off like a rocket ship after 9/11 2001. We held a prayer meeting right after that event,
Mm,
and it was a weeknight and didn't even know if anybody would come. And we got ready for the event and went to open the doors, and there was a line out out through the foyer and out into the parking lot that went
mm,
as far as you could see, and we had more people than we could get in to come and pray for our country and pray for our world.
mm,
And it was a turning point in the life of our church in that we realized a lot of things, but we realized, one, prayer is the essence of what we do, who we are as the people of God. And then that led to many other things that we wanted to do globally that God opened the doors for us to do. And, some guys who were full sail people at that time figured out how to do streaming before streaming was a thing. Everybody streams now, but at that time in the early 2000s, people didn't stream it. And so these guys figured it out. And we began to do concurrent worship services with other congregations in other parts of the world. We did that in Kiev, Ukraine, and South Africa, and Sri Lanka, and Asia, different places, South America, where we had connections with congregations, and we felt like it was important for our congregation to see that God's church is global, and
mm.
a lot of times the church in other parts of the world have figured it out way better than we have here in the United States. And so those each of those times, David, was such a meaningful thing, of watching God's people worship him for who he is and what he's done in other parts of the world, and those were memories that I'll never forget. I think it's gonna be like that in heaven, right? I mean, I think we'll be worshiping God all the time, all together, but it's gonna be different, it's gonna be better, because, the worship leader, we know who the worship leader is. And so anyway, those were wonderful
I
times.
think I think you and I share a passion for Revelation 4 and 5 and that scene in heaven where it's just worship. Uh,
I love it.
and you get to a moment, the part that's always fascinating to me is, you have those that are on their thrones. They're on the other side of this thing where all of us look to finish our race strong. And these were ones that finished their race strong and they're wearing crowns. And in the light of worship to the Father, they have to take off their crowns and bow down and recognize that even on that side, it is much better when he's not
Man.
on the throne.
Yeah.
So,
Mhm.
um,
True.
you spoke to something, and we'll kind of breeze through this a little bit, but I'm just fascinated by some of this historical context. For those that may or may not know, there was some things that you guys also did innovative in the form of kind of this church distributed model that you had. Can you talk about the philosophy that influenced how kind of that philosophy influenced your leadership? I know you're very mission minded in terms of missionary minded. You've
Mhm.
cared deeply for a global community. But what did it look like for the church distributed model, and how did it influence your leadership and the church's impact on the community?
It was controversial at the time. Um, Not everybody, there were folks who left Northland because through that time for that reason. Because I felt like we took our focus off the local community, which was not our goal to do, was not our intention, but rather to put more focus on our community by acknowledging the broadness of the kingdom of God. That's our community. The kingdom is our community. And so, but the emphasis was to be as active in learning from the church in other parts of the world as it was to try to take things to the church in other parts of the world. Because you've traveled, you know, the thing of it's not going into other continents, other parts of the world. You see that there are things that the church has figured out that we haven't here in our country. And God has really blessed the church in the United States, but He's blessed the church globally.
Mhm.
And so what it meant for us was going out and distributing, not only distributing who we were as a worshiping community, but to be distributed back into our local congregation. Uh, what other people were learning and how they were worshiping God and understanding the movement of the Holy Spirit in the world. So it was distributed in that way. And also for we felt like that was important in our own community. You know, we were in one part of the geographically, we're in one part of Central Florida, and we opened up campuses in other parts of Central Florida for the sake of letting folks worship in the place where they live, you know, close to the places they live.
What a novel idea.
Yeah, I mean, again, you can see, you know, there wasn't anything new. Exactly, yeah.
You
Exactly.
sit in Jerusalem.
Right?
Uh,
Yeah.
so yeah, so it's so funny. Thank you for sharing that insight. It it's so fascinating because some of the things that you guys were doing back then that seemed innovative and was innovative and controversial has now become some type of framework that people use, for planting churches and launching, and so it's just kind of this weird thing, where God had given a vision to you guys, and you faithfully executed that for so many years.
Mhm.
Now I do wanna tap into something that I deeply admire about you, and in some ways provokes me to envy or jealousy is your ability to step into worship in the form of music. And music and worship
Mm.
have been such a central part of your ministry. How did your background as a musician shape your approach to leading and not only leading worship, but connecting with the congregation?
Yeah, so you know, David, I it was my goal, my calling, I thought, was not necessarily to music. I really thought when I went to seminary and then came down here and worked in clinical work and campus work for a while, that I really didn't think music would be something I'd come back to. And then when I got to Northland, our congregation was small um and you know, we look around and everybody was a volunteer and like somebody said, "Well, don't you play the guitar?" And I'm like, "Yeah, you know, I play the guitar." And so I just started doing that, not every week even. And then as time went by, and the church grew and I grew in my ability. Frankly, there was a guy that came along as our worship director, a guy named Tim Tracy, who is maybe the best musician I know. And man, he challenged me and rebuked me at times and encouraged me at times and taught me to be a better musician. And I began to see it more from a biblical standpoint as a craft, as a part of what I could bring to God and to his people as an offering. And our mantra was, that we, I would say to the congregation every week, we've gathered, I would remind them of what we were there to do. We have gathered to worship God for who he is and what he's done. And then our goal in worship was to do that, was to unpack that every week as to who is God here and what, as a result of who he is, has he done, and how can we worship him And so music for me was one of the ways that was my offering to God, that I do that now in my living room, to worship in the same way that you do, I know you do. And so, that was it. And so music became just another instrument, so to speak, for worshiping God.
And thank you so much for that insight. That's such a beautiful way of engaging that. And I had the privilege, of participating in some of your worship services where you were leading, and I get emotional thinking about it now, but I think about how often you would get emotional from that stage. As you like, it would always seem like you would catch this glimpse and reminder of what you were doing and why you were doing it, and you just invited us to have this experience that you were having with the Father in real time, and so that was beautiful,
Thank
the
you.
way that you articulated that, and as we continue to kinda, like, move forward to timeline, I promise you we're gonna get to Advent, but I just wanted people to know the amazing man that I've had a privilege to know. After decades of ministry, you transitioned to chief of staff at Full Sail University, and that must have been a significant change. Um, how did your faith guide you through this decision and this time of transition? It's as by the way, someone that's 8 months into a major transition, it's as much for
Mhm.
me as for anyone else listening to this.
Hmm. Well, you would know. Um, well, so it was a transition and it wasn't, um, I knew a whole lot of people here at Full Sail, and over the years I had done different projects and things with Full Sail. Full Sail had been good to us. We hired a lot of people at Northland from Full Sail, in audio and video and whatnot. And when Gary Jones, president, talked to me about coming on staff, and I was like, "What would I do?" And he said, "I think you'll figure it out." And you know what got figured out, not just by me, is it's a whole lot like, again, like being a pastor. We have 2,200 plus faculty and staff here, 22,000 and so students here.
Mm.
And man, the most important thing that I can do, I feel like every day as I have opportunity to either in an office or walk this campus and encounter people is just to think, how can I share the love of Jesus in tangible and intangible ways to the people I encounter? And again, I know that can be such a cliche. Um, it's not, though, when you realize your life depends upon it. My life depends on that, because it's where my life comes from. And so, I get to, a lot of things here are very similar to what I did in being a part of a local church, leading a local church, and a lot of things and many new things, which I'm one of our guiding principles at Full Sail is learn and grow always. And man, I love that. And this has been a learning and growing experience. And every day is a little bit different, which I love that too. Enough of my personality to like that.
What a beautiful T-ball moment here, which is, um, as you as you've settled into your role there, what challenges have you encountered, as you've navigated the transition from church ministry to university leadership? What is that? Has there been any challenges that you can identify through this process?
I would honestly say they're not big challenges. I mean, I've had a lot to learn, but and that's challenge of sorts, but it's also an opportunity of sorts. And um I'm still learning. I mean, but I've not been challenged. I have had a real freedom here to live out, my faith, not been restricted in that, and to yet be respectful of other people that don't share that worldview. Um, and so, but I don't think that doesn't feel like a challenge to me. It feels like an opportunity.
Mm, yeah. And so, as we kind of transition through looking back, what leadership principles from your pastoral work have been the most applicable to your current role at Full?
Mhm. You know, the chief thing that I think comes to mind is humility.
Mm,
Uh, to approach anything that I do with humility and seeking wisdom, but being humble. Um, it almost I think it's true that nobody's offended by humility. You know, nobody uh, gets ticked off with with if you
I love
are humble.
proclaiming how humble you are.
Exactly,
I'm the
exactly.
most humble person. Yeah,
David, and that's a challenge though. I
yeah.
mean, the all of the things that you and I both we've talked about before of just how humility, how we even understand it, the thing I know you talked about this too, that C.S. Lewis talks about that humility is not thinking less of yourself, but it's thinking of yourself less.
Mhm,
And um because I think it's still we are human beings. We do have, self-esteem is important to
mm,
carry us through life. I heard I heard of all people Russell Brand,
mm,
the very controversial comedian, new believer, very vocal believer, say this on a thing that I was listening to a couple of weeks ago where he said, for all of my life, him speaking, I have thought little of myself, but I think of little else. It's one of those you have to think about. I think so little of myself, and yet I think of little else.
mm,
And for some people, that's going to take a little bit to sink in. It did for me when I heard him say it. And it's that juxtaposition of how we view ourselves and our humanity, but I think the keys for me in humility are frankly having friends like you,
mm,
people who will speak the truth to me and who will love me when I do well and love me when I don't do well and tell me the truth both in both directions. Um, and so that's a leadership thing that I would say I learned it at Northland in a significant way because I felt like everybody I worked with there had that same perspective of honoring God, to speak much of God and speak little of ourselves. Um, and it's going to work out.
yeah.
It's going to work out if I do.
And again, I w it seems like, because you're on the podcast, I'm telling you all this stuff, but I tell you this stuff in private, and I say it when you're not around. One of the things that I admire the most about my heroes of the faith is that there is a consistency of testimony, and what I mean by that is that in whatever room I step in, whether I'm with you or without you, that people may or may not know our proximity to one another, the testimony is the same, and what you're describing is consistent with what I've
Mm,
hear people describing you as and the affection what
mhm,
they have for and towards you and how the Father expressed his love through you, through those years where you maybe have felt that you were sloppy with it or trying to figure it out, and maybe humility did not win the day. But in
mhm,
all of those moments, you seem to have modeled what it looks like to keep coming back to the Father. And, it's this
mhm,
whole, GK Chesterton thing of just do it again, dad. Just do it.
mhm, mhm,
It's a new day, and he doesn't grow tired
mhm.
of it. Just do it again, dad.
I
So,
love that. Thank you.
I love this because this is where, I just so grateful for this conversation. Now, I lured you into this conversation with the idea of talking about Advent, and I asked you a bunch of other personal stuff, but I thought it was important for people to have a foundational at least a foundational thought of who you are and experience you in that way. There's clearly really, really deep and wide rivers inside of my brother. But one of
Mhm,
the things that I attribute to you, is just how the Father used you to illuminate Advent to me in such a special way. Because as a believer coming up in the faith community that I came up, We understood the rhythms of the seasons and seasons to remember things, but it was never really a practice. It wasn't part of our disciplines to just kind of like pause and reflect on Advent or Lent or any of those things. I think there's the crazy like candle stuff that everyone would do just as a marker of that, but to really deeply sit in it is something that I've learned from you and the rhythms of your spiritual formation. And so, as we enter into the Advent season, what does this time of year mean to you personally?
Mm. Thanks, David. Well, I love the liturgical calendar, if you
How
will.
to say that word?
Uh,
I can't say it.
you could if you wanted to bad, but
Like,
you're welcome. You're welcome. My gift to you. I love it because, the thing you use the word rhythms, Eugene Peterson is, this, paraphrases the "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest." Peterson paraphrases that, "I'll teach you the rhythms of grace." I think that's what liturgy does. It teaches us the rhythms of grace. In the Older Testament, the Hebrew people lived their life between feasts and festivals. They lived their life between uh, spending time where they would fast, and then spending times where they would feast, and it created a rhythm in the worship that they pursued. And um, in the Newer Testament, I think that process. Jesus said he didn't come uh, to do away with anything. He actually came and fulfilled everything. Uh, and it doesn't mean we have to follow those Old Testament feasts, but and fast. But I think it's interesting. There's some basic principles to learn from that. But what the liturgical calendar does for, I think, the church today, or even me as an individual worshiper, is it reminds me that this story is so big. The story of God is so big that for me to assume that I can feel it all or know it all at any given time, or even express it all at any given time,
mm,
is just not possible in my finite brain and heart.
mm,
Even in, St. Augustine in Confessions says, "How can I call you into me, God? Is there any part of me that can contain you?" And of course, no. But you know what I can contain and celebrate and worship are the parts of the story. I used to say it to our congregation, take this in as much as you can stand. As much of it as you can stand, take it in. And I think that's what liturgy does. It gives us enough. It gives us as much as we can take at any given time. And so with Advent, I don't know if you want me to roll into Advent here, but the thing that Advent does for us. So Advent, the two big uh, times, the two big dates on the church calendar are, Christmas and Easter, and um, the culture has kind of gravitated toward those more Christmas than Easter, I guess, in popular culture. But the two things of, the incarnation, you know, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, John 1:14. You know, that's just one of the most amazing verses in the Bible. One of the most amazing truths that God has ever breathed out into the universe. I'm making my dwelling among you, that the word literally is he tabernacled among us. Well, the tabernacle was where everybody came to worship God. And they couldn't even go in, most of them. But, uh, the tabernacle now is not in those buildings, it's in our bodies. I
mm,
mean, and so with that, that's the incarnation, that God would come and make his dwelling among us, is such a big thought that I can't take that all in at once. I mean, and so I'm just talking about that. Easter has its own magnificence when you think about, not only the redemptive story and the and atonement, resurrection, and the power that's in that. That's also too much to take in at once. But with Advent, it's there are parts of the church I've come to learn, parts of the global church and the historical church, um, that celebrate one over the other. In our culture, I mean, in the church anyway, I mean, you might get, I don't know if people push back on this, maybe, but it's kind of like Easter, the tradition I grew up in, redemption and atonement is the big deal because it is a big deal. To a lot of the church around the world, the incarnation is the big deal because it's a big deal. And, um, and how God saves is another thing altogether to them, to some of our brothers and sisters. So I won't get off into that. That really would spark some emails. Um, but in terms of just talking about Advent, um, so there's two words that I always think of with Advent. For one thing, Advent means waiting. It's a time of waiting. Um, but I think the two words that I think of with Advent are waiting and choice. The waiting, Tom Petty, the great theologian Tom Petty, said that waiting is the hardest part. You probably remember that song. He wasn't referring to worship, but I think that, it is waiting is hard. I mean, when you think of Advent, I wrote down some of the things you know, that the world was waiting for at the time and as part of the Advent story. Do you want me to go into a couple of these? Yeah.
You're cooking, brother. Just keep going.
I'll keep cooking. Hope I don't burn it. Hope I don't burn it.
I'm watching the show right now. And eating.
Okay. All right. Well, so the again, when Jesus came into this world, God's people were waiting 400 years. We talk about, from the end of the Old Testament to the beginning of this story. It's, people and, what how God was silent if you read those last verses of the Old Testament, so that people didn't hear from God. I think we could talk for a while about that. I won't take the time right now, but what does that really mean? Because even when God is silent, he is speaking.
Yeah.
And so but God's people were waiting 400 years to hear from God. Even the story itself, like the first characters in the story, Zachariah and Elizabeth, they'd been waiting all their life for a child. They had a child, which is a story in itself. Zachariah going into the Holy of Holies, Elizabeth being told by an angel she's going to have a child. They'd been waiting. John the Baptist was a result of that. They didn't name him John the Baptist. They named him John.
First name John, last name the Baptist.
The Baptist, yeah. Put that on a birth certificate. It's funny. I'm talking to you. I'm sitting. The sun just came out.
So now he's validating you. You say, yeah. Can I just pause for one second?
Yeah, you can.
What a beautiful reflection for those that may be listening. In that, one of the things that I find very challenging at times from faith communities is that oftentimes it puts God into tomorrow, whereas how many people are waiting for a promise? How many people are, and it's just like, dude, I need you right now, Dad. Like, I'm struggling right now. But what I love about what you're describing is that they were faithfully showing up on that day, right? Like,
Yeah.
is that
Yeah.
right? And some of us put a best use by date on the promises of God. And so we grow discouraged and frustrated and hopeless, so things don't happen according to our time. But when we find those two characters, Zacharias and Elizabeth, Zacharias still fulfilled the mandate that God had in his life. He's still acting as a priest. And in fact, it described him as upright and blameless before God, which means that even though the text tells us, history tells us that there's this 400 years of whatever that means, God is silent. Um, that these people kept showing up faithfully. And it literally goes out of its way to tell us that they were too old to have kids in the natural. which I
Mhm.
think, I just wanna layer this thought of waiting with you, on the
Oh,
story that I
yeah.
presented, because I think some of us that may be watching this, myself included, wrestle with that idea.
Mhm.
How do I faithfully show up today, when I'm not seeing the desired outcome? And in fact, the facts are telling me that the best use like, it's expired, the best use by date
Mm.
is gone, right?
Mhm.
But the truth's
Yeah.
another, and that's what I think you're describing. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, David, I love that, and it's interesting you say, they were too old to have a child, and then the next scene in the story, Mary's too young to have a child.
Right?
I mean, in our estimation, 14 years old, I mean, we'd be intervening in that family
Yeah.
if it was now, and so the Joseph and Mary story, and then talk about faithfulness and showing up. The next scene in the story is Simeon and
Mm,
Anna, in the temple. Simeon had been praying all his life for the consolation of Israel. Anna, a prophetess, had prayed. She was a widow for 62 years. And the scriptures tell us that she had been praying for the redemption of Israel. And when Mary brings the baby Jesus in, both of them realize that everything they'd been waiting for was right there. Yeah, but they showed up, to your point, they showed up every day, the faithfulness. And scripture goes out of the way to tell us that part of the story, for the reason I think you said that how do I know the right things to do today? Just get out of bed. You know, you can't even get out of bed and
keep
do your
doing
job.
this again.
Exactly, exactly. Get yourself a black coffee and go to work.
Yeah.
That's what they did. And so I think that those stories remind us too, that I heard somebody, I don't even remember who it was, but I heard somebody uh, talk about the fact that God has a fast forward button, that things move along, you think 400 years or 9 months or whatever, or 62 years,
Mm,
whatever it is. But God has a fast forward button that he can make it happen in the moment whenever he chooses. And he does that too in the story. And that's where I think the other word choice comes in. When that opportunity comes, when Mary is told she's going to have a baby, she makes a choice. She's talking to an angel and makes a choice that may it be done to me, as you say. We make a choice. I make a choice every day. One of my favorite writers is a guy named Walter Brueggemann, and Brueggemann. I had a seminary class with him a long time ago, and Brueggemann has this thing. He says that there's a choice to be made at Christmas, whether the angel is telling the truth or not. And I think we make that choice every day. We make a choice. Is God telling the truth here or not? Because I know the choices I'm supposed to make, I think, most of the time. I know the right thing to do quite often, but I'm questioning whether I'm going to believe that's the right thing to do or not.
mm,
um, Bergman, I wrote it. He says, there's a choice to be made, whether the angel is telling the truth or not, whether there's a saving among us or whether we are unsaved, whether God is with us or whether we're alone and on our own hook. And how we decide makes a difference in how we live. So we've been waiting. Advent is about waiting, but Advent is about choosing. We make this choice of, and the reason we celebrate Advent over 4 weeks and then Christmas Eve, in my family, we light a candle every week, and it stands for one of the dimensions and applications of this Advent story. And there are four of them. There's hope, joy, love, and peace. And hope is what Simeon and Anna had prayed for the consolation of Israel, for peace. That's another one, the joy and the love and et cetera. And so each of these different weeks, we focus on one of those things. Um, and, even in my in the church I worship in every week now, we're going through this now. Each week we take one of these focuses and we focus on that part of who God is in this story and what it tells us about each one of those four aspects of the story.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think again, for me, the benefit of kind of bringing all that with me in the story through the 4 weeks of Advent, and then when coming to the Christmas Eve, which is, such a wonderful time of being able to acknowledge that all these things that we've hoped for, all this peace that we've longed for, all this joy that we need culminates in the love, what love the Father has for us, that He would send us His Son to celebrate that. And that's the fulfillment of Advent. That's the incarnation. That's God tabernacling with us.
Man, thank you so much. That was so rich. I I know that there are many people that would have more questions as a result of what you just unpacked there. And my prayer is that this conversation would not be an end. It would not be a period, but a comma that leads you into a deeper dialogue with our Father. He makes himself available to us. There is the Bible, which is the authority. You can go in scriptures, and I would humbly ask that if you've not done this, that I would find your way through the Gospels in this season of reflection, that you can see this story unfold through these four different perspectives and these writers that just had been inspired to tell the story in unique ways. And so it's important that during this time, that you not take my word for it, that you not take Vernon's word for it, but that you would go and dig in yourself. I think we're in a time and a season. I think this was always the case, but I think it's more prevalent today. You can't outsource your faith. You have to do the work. You have to show up, and there is no excuse in this generation for you not to find the information because of the advent of the internet and all of the resources that are available. You should be able to find your way into this story in a way that would be meaningful and impactful for you. We were compressed on time. There's a couple of things I would love to share, for you to share, because this is a season right now where there are a lot of people that have lost loved ones. There's a lot of people that have gone through divorces. There are a lot of people that are in a state of tension or suffering, whether it be for illness or some type of tension, that this corner of the year is really difficult. I think that anytime you're going through those things, it's challenging. But I think that when you go through these holidays, they help create an amplification of whatever it is that most people are feeling. Suicidal ideation is at an all-time high. Substance abuse, all of these different things that are happening. And yet here you are, and I believe you, but here you are talking about hope. What would
Mm,
you say to someone that is deep in suffering right now, that all of that sounds theologically amazing, all of that stuff sounds
mm,
seminary level beautiful, right? But
mhm.
what does it mean for me right now in the midst of my suffering, in the midst of where up seems down and down seems up and left seems right? Like, what does hope mean to me? How would
Mm.
you point me in this moment?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, an important question, and I think the answer is in much of what you said of just how will we use this time? How will we use these days? Whether during this season or any other season of our life, the scriptures say that uh, teach me to count my days,
Mhm.
that that I can have a heart for you. And for me, David, and for our friends who may be listening here, I think the place where hope comes, first and foremost, these things work together. Hope and joy and love and peace actually work together. They're they're not just a isolated thing. Hope is not an isolated thing. Hope is a thing that comes from who God is, but it comes from who we are in community. I think one of the most significant and tangible ways to reach out and get hope in your life this is actually to do it through people, is to find community where you can be around other people, even other people who are going through the same struggles you are. That there is to find people who will love you and care for you. For me, the most obvious place to do that is in the church, in many wonderful expressions of the church in Central Florida. And and the other thing is to remember the truth of this story, the story of whichever part of the story you want to focus on, of the story of God, a story of who God is and what He's done. To me, there's great hope. The fact that this is sustained over all of these changes in people and time and places and wars and rumors of wars and difficulty, that the church has survived. And it's not, it's and God sees it and loves it. I could go on and on about that. Let me just tell you one interesting thing. So there's a song that actually was a poem that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote in 1863. It's a song called it was originally a poem. I heard the bells on Christmas Day. Their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. In 1863, our country was going through a civil war, and Longfellow himself, his son Charles, had volunteered to fight in the Union Army, and he had just when he wrote this poem, he had just gotten the word that his son had been gravely wounded. He didn't know if he would survive. But he heard those bells, and he sat down and he wrote this poem. One of the verses, though, in the poem, even as he thought of his son, where he says, "And in despair, I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth," I said, "for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men." And man, I don't know about you, but I relate to that. There are days where I go home and think, man, there is no peace on earth. I mean, we've just gone through a season where it's felt like, would we ever be united again? Will we ever have real peace among each other and in our world? But then, but then Longfellow comes back to, uh, the hope that he had, that a faith that he had in God had sustained him, and he ends the song with these words: "Then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men." Our hope is in the peace that comes through the Prince of Peace. That's not just for a culture or a nation or the world. That's personal. That's a personal peace. Because for us, if we, the reason that many times we don't have peace in our own hearts is we don't have peace with God, and we don't have peace with each other because we don't have peace with ourselves. And so my hope, your hope, I think our hope is found in being near that God, the God of peace, being near God. And the way we do that is worship. We worship Him. And that brings us near hope. That's the source of hope. I hope that makes sense.
It does. And, I just want to remind anyone that's listening to this right now, in a synthesized way, less eloquent way, but a very direct way, I would just tell you hope is a person. And in the midst of whatever suffering and tragedies and circumstances you find yourself in, I can't guarantee you what happens next. I don't know what happens next. I've prayed for plenty of people that had terminal illnesses and God didn't heal them, and yet He makes healing available. He didn't heal them on this side. I love the fact that Eugene Peterson, who we've quoted quite a bit, he says that every prayer prayed long enough ends in praise. And I don't know what you're going through and what you're suffering through, but this message today that my brother came and delivered, not only about Advent, but his life is a reflection not of being an exception. He's not an exception. He's an example of what is possible when you live a surrendered life. I always attribute it. It's again another common phrase, but the idea of walking a long walk of obedience in the same direction. That is what my brother embodies, and what he has been through is not even, we couldn't even touch any of that stuff that he's been through, even in seasons of suffering with illness and family stuff and all of that. And yet his hope is in a person. Your hope can be in a person. And that person has a name, and his name is Jesus. And so as we kind of round the bases here and close out, Vernon, it would be an incredible privilege and an honor if you would pray for anyone that is listening to this podcast, that they would have an encounter with the Father in whatever way that they would need, but also the invitation to explore this truth for themselves. There are facts. There are facts that maybe you got more month than money. There are facts that you may be suffering with some type of illness. These are all facts, but there is a truth that is greater than the fact. And it is found in Jesus. And so part of this is an active surrender into your life to his, and accepting the sacrifice that he made. So I just, Vernon, if you don't mind leading us and closing us out in prayer and praying over the people, and extending whatever invitation you feel led to extend as we wrap up here.
Thank you, David. Well, God, I thank you for my brother David, and for the fact that he is willing to take this time and interview yet another ordinary idiot like me, because of our great hope that we have in who you are and what you've done, and that it's that hope that makes us brothers. It's that hope that makes us sons and daughters. It's that hope that, as Isaiah the prophet wrote, that the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. God, you are that light. And I pray for anyone in the sound of our voices today who feels like they're walking in that darkness, that they would be right now able to take in the truth that a light has dawned, and it's dawned for them, and that light is Jesus, the wonderful Counselor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. That's who you are. And what you've done is you have brought all that to us. So, Lord, I pray that you would be with the folks that need to know that today, that beyond any words that David or I could say, that you would, by your Spirit, communicate that to the deepest part of their despair. And you would bring them into this light, into this hope, into this joy, into this peace, into this love that is you, Lord. And we pray that in the process of that you would connect them with others who can remind them. We all need to be reminded every day of what this is and who we are in you. So remind them, Lord. And in the process, I pray that you will continue to lead us into an understanding of how much we have to say to this culture, to this world. I pray for David as he continues to do this, to communicate through this podcast the truth of who you are in different ways, and different people will hear it. And I pray that you'll continue to transform the lives of those who will listen. Thank you for this time. Thank you for David. Thank you for this technology that makes this possible. We're grateful to you, the giver of all things. Thank you for giving us the gift of your Son, in whose name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you guys for spending another, whatever time this is, episode with myself. And thank you for creating space to hear from my brother. I pray that this has blessed you. I make this a special week as you focus on the meaning of Advent and the hope that comes with Jesus.